I sewed this seam from end to end, so from the front you can see there was no stopping or starting, just sewed right on the line from one end to the other. To trim it, I'll go ahead and pull this template back, and again, if you have any places where the seams from the previous pieces kind of prevent it from folding back, just kind of pull them out of the way. And then line up the 1/4 inch and trim off that side there. And now this one is ready to press. So to press it, I'll go ahead and set the seam and then kind of fold it on back, press it to the side like the rest of them have been. And now this is ready to be trimmed up and have this little piece joined right to it. For trimming it up, just like we did on those little triangles, get your ruler and your cutter and line up your 1/4 inch along that solid line. So we're going to trim off right at this dashed line on the template. And we'll trim one side at a time, so you're just going to do all of the edges all the way around. And last little piece. And then these two guys will come together just like this. The unit B and C's are all done being sewn and they're all pressed, so they are ready to trim because they only have that one seam down the middle. So let's go ahead and walk through trimming these guys. When I trim them, we're going to be adding a 1/4 inch outside of this line, which is this dashed line. So line up your 1/4 inch on your ruler along that solid line, and it should land right at that dashed line. If it doesn't, then something happened when you printed your templates, and hopefully it does. And then just rotate it around after you trim the one seam, and repeat for all 3 sides for all of the pieces for each of the units. And then once it's trimmed up, it is going to be ready to piece. Isn't that pretty? It'll be ready to piece together with unit C. So these will actually get sewn together after they're trimmed. So this is a unit C. If you take a peek at the seam allowance, on each seam allowance I put where they are to be joined. So join unit C here, join unit B here. So these will actually get joined, putting right sides together just like this, and we'll sew from end to end along that seam. So to join these guys, draw your fine line of glue on the inside of your seam allowance toward that edge. Put right sides together where it says join. So it's easy to want to do this because that makes a nice square, but this is actually how the units need to be put together to be pieced together to make that whole quadrant. Now once that's joined, you can double check to make sure those seams match there, and look how nice that really comes together really nicely right here. And with them glue basted, they won't shift. They will stay matched up when you go to sew them. And then when you go to sew them, you're just going to sew from end to end. No stopping or starting, just straight through on that piece, and then we will press that so the piece looks just like that. Now I have also sewn this unit B to unit A along that seam there. Now this is going to be a little bit different what I'm going to do. So take a deep breath. I am not pressing this seam open. Often in paper piecing, seams are pressed open, but I, again, don't recommend it. But what I do recommend is tearing off this foundation. See how nice and easy that tears off, and it kind of feathers at the edge too. Tear off the seam allowance. You can tear it off on both sides if you like. This just reduces bulk. This is why a small seam, a smaller stitch length is really helpful, because it helps these tear off more easily. Okay, so tear all that out of the seam allowance, and then we are going to press this toward Unit B. If you are an adamant seam presser opener, seam presser opener, and you really are like, nope, Cristy, I'm sorry, I understand why you are not pressing it open, but I choose to press it open, go for it. I have given you all the information as to why to press this to the side, that it keeps your seam stronger. It doesn't weaken the seam by making it, the strength of it, only as strong as the thread. It also makes it flatter and more easier to quilt. So if you have all that information, you still want to press the seam open, then certainly. To do that, to open up this, don't get it wet. Please, oh please. Take a little cuticle stick or some sort of a stiletto. Here I'm just going to use the end of my scissors here. That's what I had handy. And find a little opening of your seam and just run it through. Just like that. Kind of pinch it, and then you'll just run your tool, whatever that might be, through the seam to release any glue. You can use your fingers, but sometimes that makes the fabric stretch out. So I like to just use a little tool. I like the wooden cuticle sticks the best when I do have to open up a glued seam. Using a tool is the best way to go. But again, I'm not recommending it. So I'm just going to press toward my Unit B and leave it just like this, so it is ready to join along that line there. I'll do that for all 4 of the Unit B's and C's that are sewn together. So to align these, the easiest way to make sure it gets centered is to fold this in half along the yellow and give a little pinch right here. And now that little center line will match up with that seam. And we'll just draw a little line of glue right here along this edge. And then I'm going to align. So I'm going to align that seam right along that crease, and then make sure everything aligns really nicely on both sides. Then just give it a little tap in place and then heat set it. And now it's ready to piece. So to piece it, we'll just sew right across that line, and then when we press it, we're going to press after sewing, we'll tear out that seam allowance, the foundation and the seam allowance on both sides. And then when we press it, we'll press toward the center band, and then the quadrant will be complete. And then after you have all 4 of these done, then we'll put them together just like a simple 4-patch, and your block will be finished. So at my machine, I sewed this seam joining the larger Unit A to the joined Unit B and C triangle, just from end to end, right through that line, and clipped my threads, of course, and now it's ready to press. Before pressing, I am going to take out the foundation out of the seam allowance here. I'm going to end up pressing this toward the lighter yellow band. So really I only need to take out the paper in between that seam here, right in here, since I'm going to press toward that band, that will just reduce some bulk. I can take it out of both sides, and you certainly can if you want to as well. It reduces a lot of bulk with the foundation if you're using that. If you're using paper, just regular old paper, you're going to need to tear it out of the seam allowance one way or the other at some point in time. So you can certainly do it now, then you don't have to do it later. I also recommend doing it now, even with the foundation, because we are going to join the 4 quadrants here. And if you've got foundation here after sewing that seam, it just makes it easier to tear it out now rather than fighting with it later. So just tear that out, and then it's ready to press. And I'll do the same. We'll do the same for all 4 quadrants. And then they will all be ready to piece together. I'm really happy with how this turns out, and I hope you're really happy with yours as well. So once you have all of your quadrants pressed and have that foundation or paper taken out of your seam allowance, double check the size of each one. This full block is 12.5 inches, so each quadrant is going to be 6.5 inches. Take a square ruler and just double check that it is in fact 6.5 inches. If there are any shortages, so let's say right here for some reason I ended up being really short, then you could take just a little pencil or something and mark on your seam allowance that that edge is a little short. So when you're piecing these together, you can keep it square and keep that alignment, so that way it doesn't end up making a piece that's poofed up in the middle. And that way you can make sure when it's pieced, you're not making a piece that is poofed up in the middle because you're sewing together narrower seams and trying to maintain that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just double check. Also, you can double check your 45 degree that it runs right through the 2 yellow star pieces and then up through the middle of your gray triangles. It's just a good way to check your alignment and give yourself a little pat on the back for for doing such a great job. But I do always recommend checking your blocks just to make sure they are the right size, especially since we're joining this piece to this piece and they were not paper piece or foundation piece together. And then once you have checked all your pieces, let's just do one more just to see. I do prefer putting this corner up just to start with. And let's see. All right. Okay, this is a great example. All right, so this legitimately, something happened. Could not tell you what. But as I'm aligning my outside edge here and out here, you can see right, let's move this so you can see. You can see right here, I just have a little bit of a shortage. It's not much, it's less than 1/8 of an inch. Maybe if I gave it a little press and kind of pushed it out and held my weight on there, kind of give it a little bossing around. Let's see if that made any difference. So realign that. It's a slight difference. So that edge is still a tad short. So with that edge being just a tad short, I want to make sure when I'm piecing it, I just stay aware of it. It's pretty good up here, but down here is when it gets a little short. So I'm going to put a couple of dashed lines right there to remind myself, hey, this edge is short. Be aware of that when you're piecing. And so when I'm piecing that, that way I can just make sure when I'm putting these together, I put them in the right position. I made the line just a little bit darker so you can see them. I want to show you how all these blocks are going together, just like this. So when I'm piecing these, and let's say I will join these two together, and I'm going to align them. I'm going to make sure when I'm aligning these guys that I keep that outside corner, this outside corner, really nice and straight, because I know these were just fine. Something, I don't know, maybe I shifted it, who knows. Little things can happen when you're piecing. So I'll keep those nice and straight, and then when I piece this together, you can see that that shortage, that little bit of shortage right here, is going to be absorbed in the seam allowance, and it's going to disappear. Everything will still match up good and fine, but what I am not going to do is align it here, making my outside edge off. So if I were to align this edge and sew it right on the line here, then my pieces out here would not align, and then when I tried to piece this to the sashings and into the full quilt, it wouldn't work as well. So working from the outside edge, keeping that square, and just absorbing that shortage here will make a huge difference in making sure that my block ends up being 12.5 inches like it's supposed to. So to join those, I'm going to glue baste them together. And then right sides together, and just like I mentioned, I'm going to start out here with that squared up corner. I'm going to align these two pieces so they stay square. Just peel it back so I can tell that it's all positioned nicely. Align that, and then tap in place where I glue basted. Just kind of hold it and anchor it. And then give it a little heat set. Give it a couple extra seconds, more than you would normally, because it also, the heat has to go through your foundation as well. So now you can see right here that shortage of the seam allowance is going to be compensated for, and it's going to work out really nicely. So to sew this seam, I'm going to start at the end up here and come down to this point and stop and start, because that will help the seams to spin in the middle, at, just like we did with other blocks for this block of the month. So stopping and starting right here will let the seams open up and give a nice center spin, especially with having 8 different star quadrants coming together, these little spires. It'll make that center really, really nicely spin out, just like this one here. So we'll do that for both sets of 2. So we'll have this set plus the other 2, and then we'll come back and we'll get this block finished up. So as you're glue basting your 2 quadrants together, in addition to checking that the gray star points match up, also pull back your yellow band corner and make sure that those align as well. That'll give your corners a nice matching point, and everything will fit together really well for you too. There's 2 edges on that yellow band. This side you can see a little bit better, right? Both of these, the top and bottom. You can see here how they're just laying right on top of each other. So when I place it down, tap it in place just to hold it and heat set it, it'll be ready to sew, and those points where I want them to match won't shift, and they'll piece together really, really nicely. Both of these are pieced, and as I was piecing them, I realized I forgot to mention something in the part just before this about piecing them. I do recommend starting at that 1/4 inch down when you're piecing at that point here. So starting at that center intersection, so that way you can start with your needle down and do a back stitch and then just sew off the edge. I feel it's much easier than starting at the top and then trying to stop at that exact spot at that 1/4 inch. So if you're finding that you have trouble stopping at the 1/4 inch, flip your piece over and start at the 1/4 inch down and then just sew off the edge down here. Now we do need to take out the foundation out of the seam allowances. So we'll do that for all of the edges that are going to be joined. If you've done foundation or paper piecing in the past and you're taking out your foundation and you end up with a little bit inside of an overlapping seam allowance, a pair of angle tweezers can help a lot to get that little bit out if it's in the way. But go ahead and do that for all of the edges so we can join the next section and finish up the full block. After tearing out the paper, set your seam. You know, tearing out the paper can also stretch it a little bit, so setting your seam is going to help a lot here. And then we're going to press to the side. I'm going to press to the side of the darker yellow. Do make sure as you're placing these that your grays, gray number 2, which is darker, and gray number 4, which is lighter, are placed on opposite sides and alternating sides. So this is my gray number 2, darker, then gray number 4, lighter, and then down here underneath the gray number 4, I'm going to put my other number 2, and so they'll be opposite corners from each other. So kitty corner. Then it will come together just like this. We'll glue baste along this long seam here. So with our, now the seams are pressed to the opposite sides, even though when they were like this, I pressed both to that darker yellow. When we rotate it around, now they are in opposite directions, so we can nest them and glue baste them and sew them, and then that center will spin like we've done on other blocks in the block of the month. So just draw that fine line of glue again, all the way across through your intersection. And then we will nest these. So starting from the center out, nest that center all the way out to the edge. Now, I'm just going to turn this toward me. It makes it a little easier. But I want to show you, see there, how that center is nested and they just lay right on top of each other. Make sure the corners out here match. That way any shortages on those center seam allowances will just be inside of the seam allowance. You don't have to worry about it at all. I'm going to just give myself an anchor point right here. That way I can just keep working on the rest, aligning everything as I go down. And then I'll heat set all of these. And again, that is already anchored, so it just helps me align the rest without moving it when it's glue basted and not heat set yet. So this is all ready to sew. Now, when you're sewing paper piecing, if it is a good idea to raise the foot pressure on your foot. With those extra layers of paper, sometimes having the pressure on your foot be really tight or low can make these feed unevenly and kind of shift your papers away from the fabric. So raising the foot pressure to give a little bit more space between the feed dogs and the foot can help a lot with more even feed of your seam. Every machine is going to be a little bit different for that, so if you do want to give that a try, just check your manual to see how you can adjust your foot pressure. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this seam from end to end and press it, and then our block will be finished. Sew your seam from end to end just like I did, following that solid line, and then rip out your seam allowances. I did tear out the foundation from both sides of the seam allowance, and now it's going to look so good. It's ready to have your final press. Set your seam, especially after ripping out that paper. It just helps kind of put it back in place. It's going to come together so nice. And now, because you stopped and started at that 1/4 inch, your center right here, when you press to the opposite sides, will open up, and then you'll have a nice, pretty center with your foundation pieced block. So let's go ahead and press those in the opposite directions. And see how the points on your stars match up so nice. All right. And do give, you know, you're pressing through foundation here, so give a little bit of pressure. And I hope that yours turned out really lovely and that you're happy with how your points all come together. And we'll make sure, if you have a nice big ruler, a 12.5 inch or larger, that your block measures 12.5 inches. And then it is ready for piecing into your Stellar Stars Block of the Month quilt. Do leave the foundation on if you're using the Sharon Secret foundation. It can stay in, it will it'll wash away, it'll turn into a really light tissue because there's no adhesives, so it'll just blend right into your batting after it's been quilted. If you're using paper, leave the paper in until you've pieced the quilt. That's a good rule of thumb. If you want to, you can take the paper out. I'm going to leave that up to you. I don't have a steadfast rule for this point because, and here's the reason why, these blocks are going to be joined to sashings that are not paper pieced. So those sashings will help stabilize the block as well. So you can leave the paper in or take it out. Most of the time when paper piecing is being done as a full quilt, the whole quilt is paper piece, so usually they'll stay in to help give stability to the quilt. But in this case, we are going to be adding some sashing, so feel free, if you would rather, to take out your papers. And if and when you do, double check the size of your block. Sometimes taking out the papers can release fabric that might have been puckered accidentally and kind of change the size a little bit. So just double check that for yourself, that it's still going to be 12.5 inches, and then when it's pieced in, it will be 12 inches. Thank you so much for joining me for making your Mississippi Star block. I can't wait to see yours. Please feel free to share your block on our Facebook group. Please ask any questions you feel there or in the comments of this video. And remember, if you want to join us for this block of the month, you can sign up anytime and you'll receive all of the patterns for the previous month, so you can catch up at your leisure and ask questions and join us on Facebook in our group over there. Happy sewing, and I will see you next month.